As many of you might have noticed, it's been almost 6 months since the derailment in East Palestine, and if you've been following along, you'll note that to date there has been exactly 0 new pieces of federal legislation to address railway safety in any way whatsoever. Albert Einstein once said doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. That is apparently what we're expecting here. Lawmakers seemingly losing all sense of urgency to do anything about this. If you've been watching Status Coup for a while, you've heard me say probably a dozen times that the further we get away from this disaster, the less likely legislation actually getting through the Senate, the House, and being signed by the president is to occur. I hope that is not the case, but with recent reporting from Politico, it seems like that bill, which has been spearheaded by a delegation of Ohio and Pennsylvania senators, bipartisan group, J.D. Vance, Sherrod Brown, as well as both senators from Pennsylvania on board, seemingly starting to fall apart. Let's get into that article from Politico. GOP discord threatens Senate response to railway disaster. Senator J.D. Vance insists that the support is there. His colleagues say the bill needs significant changes before it could get enough GOP backing. An internal GOP dispute between party leaders and a motley crew of junior lawmakers is threatening to sink a bipartisan rail safety bill aimed at responding to February's toxic spill in East Palestine, Ohio. Top Republicans aren't currently lifting a finger to help the rail bill, which is 2 GOP senators short of 60 votes and even more votes short of having a chance in the GOP-controlled House. The bill's lead Republican sponsor, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, is optimistic about its prospects, but as of now, there's a chance it could get filibustered on the floor without significant changes, according to interviews with a dozen senators. The rail safety divide within the Republican Party is a microcosm of its realignment over the past few years. Former President Donald Trump supports it, but other than Senators Mitt Romney, the effort gets almost all of its GOP support from the party's small yet growing populist wing. And unless the party's establishment gets more fully on board, the safety plan Vance shaped up with Senator Sherrod Brown may stall out. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said publicly this week that he's undecided on the bill, but many of his allies view the proposal's new requirements for rail staffing and inspection as an anathema to the party's long-held small government stance. As Senator John Cornyn of Texas put it, quote, "It seems like it's just too much government regulation." There are some things that were added simply to kind of get the unions on board with it, Senate Minority Whip John Thune, a former Commerce Committee chair, said of the bill. Thune added that some of its provisions, quote, "are very objectionable from the regulatory standpoint and handing a whole ton of power over to the Biden administration." The article continues with a quote from an anonymous GOP senator saying to the reporter that they think that J.D. Vance is essentially getting the runaround here and that folks might tell him, yeah, I'm mostly on board with this, but it doesn't have the votes to pass. They're not going to want to vote for it if they don't think it's going to ultimately get across the finish line. I've been saying this again, like I said, for a couple months, that the longer we wait, the less pressure is going to be put on these senators on both sides of the aisle to get this across the finish line. It's fallen out of the media cycle completely for the most part, with the exception of an odd story here or there. Most people in the country forgot that this happened at this point because everyone has a very short attention span and is seeing what is next trending on Twitter or Threads or wherever you're getting your information these days, rather than focusing on the fact that a small town was essentially sacrificed by a multi-billion-dollar corporation who happens to donate to most of these politicians' campaigns, who then are supposed to go back and regulate that same company. We just sacrificed a small town here, and everybody's kind of moved on. Unfortunately, these folks are still dealing with health implications, a whole bunch of questions, being gaslit by federal agencies, and in a few years, very probably cancer. So glad everybody moved on from that. Meanwhile, in 2022 were over 1,000 train derailments, according to the Federal Railway Administration. Over 1,000. It's averages out to be almost 3 a day. And we've passed no legislation when we've seen the damage that these things can do is absolutely outrageous. Despite the dragging of the feet at the federal level, We are seeing some movement at the state level. Some of you will remember about a month and a half ago, I spoke with Pennsylvania State Representative Abigail Salisbury about legislation that she co-sponsored in the state house that actually passed through the House and is moved on to the Senate. Let's take a little bit of a look back and listen to what she and her colleagues were working to include in their bill that ultimately passed the House in Pennsylvania.
Representative Matzey was the prime sponsor of this bill. He authored the legislation. I'm signed on as a co-sponsor of it. I was really happy to see it moved out of committee really quickly and was passed finally in the House. So now it, of course, has to go to the Senate. Basically, it's some common sense things that were being asked for on both sides from Republicans and Democrats. So although it was Democratic legislation, they were things that had been raised for several months by Republican representatives too. So I'm hopeful that it'll get bipartisan support. Essentially, we're looking at things like limiting the length of trains to 1.5 miles, which limiting something to 1.5 miles was kind of surprising to me, but basically you could have 3-mile long trains, and my understanding from the research I've done is the longer the train is, the more likely there is for more likely a derailment would be. So I think that's important. One of the things that I saw a number of Republican representatives mention is that in their communities there aren't overpasses. There are just trains that stop in the middle of town, and they can sit there idling for as long as they want. They can block emergency vehicles getting from one side of town to the other, so it limits the amount of time that they can do that. Something else I also think is important is specifying a minimum staffing on the trains themselves. Sometimes there might only be one person on there, and so if something goes wrong, they can't abandon the train to go and investigate what's going on. So you have to have at least 2 people, which to me seemed like common sense, but apparently we have to legislate that. Also, there's something on there that would require the railroad companies to allow union representatives to do safety inspections for their membership, because of course many railroad employees are unionized, and up until now apparently there was an issue that the railroad companies would call the police and say that the union reps were trespassing so that they could not do certain types of inspections. So there's just there's some other things in the bill, but those are just some sort of bullet points, if you will.
Obviously, those are fairly common sense regulations that are being proposed in the state of Pennsylvania. Having a minimum of 2 people on a train that is, in many cases, miles long seems reasonable. Limiting the length of a train to 1.5 miles seems more than reasonable. You should probably cut that in half again. That seems ridiculous to have a train 1.5 miles long that have 2 people responsible for it, especially when those trains can be carrying toxic chemicals, as we've seen in this instance, among other dangerous things. One other additional piece of information that she didn't mention there was a stipulation for increased wayside detectors. Those are detectors that actually are looking at the temperatures of wheels and bearings and whatnot on the trains that would essentially set off an alarm to let the conductors on the train know, hey, you've got something heating up that's not supposed to be heating up. In this case that happened in Ohio and East Palestine, those detectors actually did go off. The railroad declined to pay attention to them. It didn't reach a level that they thought was too critical, even though it went off at multiple occasions along the route. But I will say there's one major issue with this that makes the proposed legislation in the state of Pennsylvania essentially unenforceable. There is a risk of, when you do go to enforce this and levy fines against the railroad in question, if they were to violate any of these things, that it will very much likely just end up in the courts. Let's take a listen to what Representative Salisbury was talking about there.
But in theory, we would be able to have that consequence. Now, should this pass the Senate, I have every expectation that it will be subject to a legal challenge from the railroads based on the Interstate Commerce Clause, because the federal government, of course, in the Constitution has the ability to regulate interstate commerce, which is a pretty broad sweeping provision in the Constitution, because almost everything is considered interstate commerce. But I'm happy to see that you do what you can do, And we are not federal legislators, but we are legislators, and so we can at least try to implement this in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So the objection that we've received from various industry groups or the railroads themselves is that they believe this is unconstitutional under the Interstate Commerce Clause. So I think that there's every likelihood that the first time someone tries to levy a fine for this, should it get passed through the Senate, then there will be a constitutional challenge. But I think it's important to at least show that we have the intention to be doing something about this.
So really, it's clear that what is needed is federal legislation. Again, that's going to be an issue. Even if this does get the votes to get through the Senate, the House is, again, majority Republican. The votes are not there at the moment, at least. There would need to be a massive campaign to be able to make the votes be there to get that happen, to get this across the finish line. If that bill did make it to the White House, I'm sure President Biden would sign it. But that would be the second piece of paper that he's got on his desk to sign from the East Palestine situation, as right now the kind of flawed disaster request from Governor Mike DeWine is also sitting on his desk. It's been there for over a week, and the president has yet to sign it. Again, there are flaws with that bill. We'll make sure we link the video down below that kind of goes through some of the flaws of that bill. I discussed it with Melissa Mays, who is very familiar with that sort of thing from her own dealings in Flint, Michigan. That is definitely a flawed issue there. In addition, I mean, it seems very, very outrageous to me that you've got Republican Senator John Cornyn right now, my senator in Texas, saying, quote, "It just seems like too much government regulation." To me, it seems absolutely outrageous that it's seen as too much government regulation to ensure that a train that can carry lots and lots and lots of chemicals that can kill people in all of the towns that it drives through, that 3 of these things derail every single day, that's okay. Making sure that we can do a couple things to try to prevent that from happening, do a couple things to make sure that the appropriate staff are on board, to make sure that the information gets to local officials fast enough when a disaster does happen so that we can get citizens out in time, is too much government regulation. These are, it may seem like this is getting specific and it's like focusing in on the railroads, but think about all the regulations that are in place for airlines. Like it would be, can you fly a plane with one pilot? Absolutely. Do we do that? No, because it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Trains, while they may be on a specific track, still can do a lot of harm, a lot of danger to people in communities they're driving through, in roads that they're crossing. It needs to be treated in a similar way. In some cases, the train can be more dangerous, as we've seen. So the idea that this is just too much government regulation is absolutely absurd. We absolutely need to be looking at getting this passed at a federal level. If that is something you're into, I mean, get on the phone with your senators, get on the phone with your House representatives, because frankly, in my opinion, it's been too long. The likelihood of this passing doesn't feel great to me. I think it should pass, but the likelihood of it passing does not feel great. We'll ultimately see where it ends up going. Hopefully they get something here. This isn't much that's in this bill. This bill should be much stronger. This bill should be much, much stronger. There are a lot of additional regulations that could be going into this thing that are not right now. Most of what is in there right now is absolutely reasonable, more than reasonable. We'll see if these senators, who again, in many cases are taking money directly from Norfolk Southern or another railroad, taking money directly from the big banks that own a large portion of them, including JP Morgan, Vanguard, BlackRock. Those 3 companies own a little less than 20% of Norfolk Southern. The financial incentives here don't make any sense. You've got the people who are literally making money off of these companies in the form of donations now need to regulate these companies, and we're seeing in real time exactly how that plays out. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good day.